in a minute, Emma Dutton and Melanie Ross. Emma, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thank you.
Okay, we may begin.
Welcome everyone to this webinar on implementing a risk-based thinking approach. Melanie Ross and I will be your presenters for today. And David, I'm just trying to see how to change the slides because I don't seem to have control yet. Sorry about the delay.
Emma, it should be on the left-hand side of the screen. There's little tiny arrows.
Yeah, I'm just not seeing that on my screen, so I apologize for the delay. I'm not seeing those arrows. Okay, let me see if I can get this to pop up in my menu. All right, there it is. Thank you. All right, here we go. Excellent. So for some logistics, just at the beginning, want to let you know that we are all coming in muted. And due to the high attendance, we typically keep everyone on mute. But you can, in the Q&A panel, type in any questions that you may have. So please enter those questions into that Q&A box, and we have some planned time to address any of those questions that come in. So a little bit about the presenters. We have Melanie Ross with us today. She is a technical products developer, and she has over 20 years in quality assurance experience, as well as quality control and quality management. She is an employee of ANAB and designs and develops training courses and supports client outreach through business development activities. I'm Emma Dutton. I'm an instructional designer with ANAB. I have about 11.5 years as a quality assurance manager in a forensic laboratory, as well as 12 years doing research and development in pharmaceuticals and biotech industries. I also have some experience with teaching courses as an adjunct professor. So we're going to talk about risk-based thinking. And the first thing we need to talk about is what is risk and how is risk defined? There are several documents out there that do give definitions of risks. One of those documents is ISO 9000, and it really defines risk as the effect of uncertainty, with an effect being a deviation from the expected. So to put it another way, a risk is the potential for a deviation from the expected. This deviation from the expected can be caused by a number of things, most notably a shortage of information, misinformation, or misinterpretation of information. You have to think of risk as both half empty or half full if you go to that glass analogy. We often think of risk, though, as just negative, but it's not just negative. It comes with opportunities as well. So you have to think about that risk as being both positive and negative, and really a risk can address, create, or result in an opportunity and or threats. So risk-based thinking is often considering if that glass is half full or half empty. So building and incorporating a risk-based thinking approach will give you the flexibility to make informed decisions about whether you want to accept the risk in order to take advantage of the opportunity, or whether you want to reject the risk because the risk is too impactful to your management system. So for example, suppose you want to hold a training event on a new technology and you want to have all personnel attend at the same time. There is a risk that the budget will be negatively impacted. There's a risk that you're going to decrease productivity as well while having all these individuals out at training at the same time. However, you're also taking advantage of an opportunity to have all personnel receive the training at the same time. Thus, they're getting consistency in the training and in the message, and they'll all be trained at the same time. You have to consider, does the opportunity outweigh the risk? So why is risk-based thinking incorporated into ISO standards? Looking at risks and opportunities and adopting a risk-based thinking approach really does allow for flexibility in your management system. And actually, risk-based thinking puts you in the driver's seat so you can decide what is the best way to achieve the desired outcome based on your unique aspects of your management system and the challenges and opportunities that you face. It is really more proactive. It's like taking preventive action and putting it on steroids, so to speak. Risk-based thinking is more proactive by supporting a culture of proactively approaching your potential nonconformities and then reducing those undesired effects through early identification and planning. Just think how much time, money, frustration you could save if you could actually prevent nonconformities from occurring. And that's what it's all about. Identify the risks, plan the approach, and think about stopping those nonconformities from occurring. It provides for more consistency in the output of your operations. It increases the likelihood of meeting the management system objectives and overall the effectiveness of the management system, and helps the organization to achieve improved results. So to summarize, risk-based thinking really does help makes preventive action part of your routine management system operations. It helps to identify opportunities for improvement. It becomes integrated into your management system processes. And in this way, everyone in your management system is involved at all levels of the organization, and it really does consider both internal and external content. So let's think about some common requirements for adopting a risk-based thinking approach. In several ISO documents, ISO 9001, ISO IEC 17025, as well as ISO IEC 17020. They all have very standard requirements for how to incorporate risk-based thinking into your management system. First, understand the reasons or the why for doing risk-based thinking. Risk-based thinking gives you assurance, it enhances your opportunities for improvement, and it helps to prevent and or reduce an undesired or negative effect. Secondly, be proactive in thinking and planning the actions to take that will address the risks and opportunities, and think about how to integrate these actions into the management system. And then lastly, there are requirements that say any actions that you do take to address risks and opportunities need to be proportional to the potential impact on the validity of the laboratory results. So keep in mind, there are no requirements for formal methods for risk management or a documented risk management process. Laboratories can decide whether or not to develop more extensive risk management methodologies than what is required by these standards. There are additional risk-based thinking methodologies in some ISO documents that are very applicable. And we're going to talk about some of these risk-based thinking approaches in just a bit. But let me give you some examples of risks and opportunities, because we often think about risk-based thinking to only think about the risk aspect, but opportunities go hand in hand with risk-based thinking. You must plan your response to risks and opportunities. We've talked about how risks can also present opportunities. They do go hand in hand. So let's talk about the responses that you might have to risks versus responses to opportunities. First, when you identify a risk or an opportunity, you need to think about what those responses are going to be to that risk or that opportunity. For a risk, you can decide just to accept the risk. That is, you acknowledge the risk, and that risk could lead to a nonconformity, but you're accepting that that could be the potential outcome. And in this case, you take that chance that you could, in some cases, there is the likelihood that you could have that nonconformity and have that negative impact. But if that does happen, you'll deal with it when you have that nonconformity occur. Another type of response would be to mitigate the risk. In this mitigation response, it measures or it puts in place how you can actually minimize the likelihood of the negative impact if it were to occur, or you can eliminate the potential for that risk to occur. So you put measures in place to either do both, minimize or eliminate the likelihood of the risk from occurring, or minimize that impact of that negative effect. You can also avoid the risk altogether. And in this case, it would be eliminating that risk completely. For example, you could change your plans, decide not to take advantage of an opportunity because the risk is too high. Basically, you don't take the risk and thus eliminate the potential for that negative impact. And lastly, you could transfer the risk. In this example, you could get another party to take all or some of the risk, like maybe get insurance or outsource the task or activity, or get a partner to share in the activity with you so the risk is shared. Opportunities go hand in hand with risks, just like the responses. So opportunity responses are very similar in the sense that you can enhance the opportunity. That is, you take actions to increase the likelihood that the opportunity will occur, and you actively pursue that opportunity. So you make it happen. Or you could exploit the opportunity through implementing actions to ensure that the desired outcome will definitely occur. It's also possible to reject the opportunity. Maybe in these situations, the opportunity is a good opportunity, but you reject the opportunity because the risk of that opportunity is too high. So the impact of a negative effect would be too costly. Or lastly, you could share the opportunity, which is very similar to transferring the risk. You can take on a partner to share in some of the opportunity, generally in return for increased likelihood that the event will occur. For example, if you do not have adequate capacity or capability to achieve the outcome, you might partner with a group or an entity that can provide that capability or that capacity needed, therefore, or thereby sharing in that opportunity. There are several basic steps. In this case, we outline 5 basic steps to risk assessment or risk-based thinking approach. Of course, one of the first things that you have to do in this process is to identify the risks and opportunities. After you identify the risks and opportunities, then you have to think about how you are going to analyze the risks and evaluate those risks and opportunities. Once you analyze and evaluate the risks and opportunities, then you have to think about the impact of those risks or the significance of those risks and opportunities and how you want to respond to that, both for risks and opportunities. Once you plan your response or the actions that you're going to take, then of course you'll need to incorporate those into your management system. And just like most everything that we do, once we make changes to our management system, then we have to evaluate it after some time to determine the effectiveness of that response that we took. Melanie's going to now walk you through some of the approaches for how to identify risks and opportunities, and for how to analyze these risks and opportunities and evaluate these risks and opportunities.
Melanie, you are the presenter.
All right, thank you so much, Emma. I am having the same issue that you were getting the controls to show up. So if you'll give me 1 second. I think it just takes a second for those controls to show up. Emma, did you have to do anything to get the controls, or did they just show up after you became presenter?
They appear and disappear. So when you scroll over the screen or click on the screen, they will appear and then they'll disappear. So,
Yeah, I'm not having them at all
Seeing it?
appear.
Okay.
No, there's
All right.
nothing there.
Here, I'll do it for you.
Yeah, that'll be great if you could just.
Hopefully it'll show up in a minute. Okay.
I've got them.
Okay, thank you so much.
Just tell me when you need to advance.
Yep, if you just give me 1 second, I've got to pull up one thing here. Sorry about this, participants. We appreciate your patience while we work through these technical issues. So as Emma just said, we have several different steps in the risk assessment process. We've narrowed it down to 5 steps. And here in the rest of this presentation, we're going to talk about some of the approaches that you can use for each of those steps. I want to preface this with these are not all of the approaches. These are just some that we've highlighted for this webinar. So some of the approaches that you can use for risk identification are brainstorming, structured or semi-structured interviews, and surveys. So there are many different approaches that you can use, and oftentimes a blended approach works best. These 3 approaches can be used again for risk identification, and the list is not comprehensive. It's just the 3 that can be used as standalone or in combination with other approaches. Brainstorming, the use of structured or semi-structured interviews, and surveys are relatively easy ways to identify the risks to your organization. So let's take a look at each of these in a bit more detail. If you could go to the next slide, please. Whoever has control of the slides, could we move to the next one, please?
I'm on the brainstorming identifies slide.
I see approaches risk identification. That's the slide I'm seeing.
That's very weird.
Let me make you the presenter again. There you go. I will just keep you as the presenter so that you can change the slides for me. Thank you very much. Brainstorming is a group problem-solving technique. It sometimes involves the spontaneous contribution of ideas from a group, or it can be one or more individuals mulling over a situation in an attempt to identify ideas. So brainstorming can be structured or unstructured, or you can think of that as formal or informal. So if we have a structured brainstorming session, we have a plan in place, we have an objective that we've made, and we're going to guide the individuals in that brainstorming session to brainstorm that particular problem or that particular risk. If it's unstructured or more informal, this may be something where it's just an office conversation where you identified a problem and you're talking about different ways to resolve it. So when it's unstructured, you can also think about it where everyone yells out an idea and a scribe writes them down. So that's another way to think of unstructured. When it's structured, we start with one factor, such as equipment, and then in a structured manner, go to each individual in the room and ask for their ideas of things to consider. You can also use a round robin approach where you break into teams or individually, everyone or the team takes one category and lists everything that they think should be considered, and then go to the next category. You can also do brainstorming as an anonymous activity. You have the individuals record their ideas privately, collect these, and then display them so all can see. A good way to do brainstorming is to give everyone a sticky notepad and everyone writes down their thoughts. So if you're looking at a risk assessment, you're trying to identify what could go wrong in a process. Everyone can just write down all those things that could go wrong or opportunities that they could take to enhance the process. You collate all of those and then you use those thoughts and others as tools to stimulate the creativity of each of the stakeholders. And then you can prioritize the discussion that was had, prioritize the items that were discussed and in a group discussion in order to determine which one of those are likely to occur. And then that's when you move into the analysis portion of the brainstorm or of the risk assessment process. So again, for structured brainstorming, the facilitator breaks down the issue to be discussed into sections and uses prepared prompts to generate ideas on a new topic when one is exhausted. Unstructured brainstorming, like I said, is much more less formal. In both cases, though, the facilitator will start off a train of thought, and everyone in the group is expected to generate ideas. The pace is kept up to allow ideas to trigger that lateral thinking, and then the facilitator can suggest a new direction or apply a different creative thinking tool when one direction of thought is exhausted or discussions deviate too far. So the goal here with brainstorming is to collect as many diverse ideas as possible for that later analysis. If we could go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. The pros of brainstorming include that it is useful when you need to identify risks associated with a new process, technology, or opportunity. It's very quick and easy to do, and it aids communication on projects. But keep in mind, groups tend to generate fewer ideas than individuals working alone, because oftentimes people may be scared to speak up in the group, or one person may dominate that group idea and come up with their own ideas of what those risks and opportunities would be. Particular group dynamics might mean that some people with valuable ideas stay quiet while others dominate the discussion. This can be overcome by an effective facilitator or effective facilitation. You want to encourage creative thinking, and new ideas can mean that conversations don't always stay focused on the matter being considered, and this takes up the meeting time. It's difficult to keep people on task, so you need to have an objective for this brainstorming session. What project, what process, what product are you going to be looking at to identify the risks related to that? And then it's also difficult to demonstrate that the process has been comprehensive. We want to make sure in brainstorming that we're identifying those uncertainties, the successes or failure modes, the causes and consequences, the criteria for decisions, and the options for treatment. This kind of moves into that analysis portion where we want to make sure that we have been comprehensive. So we're not just brainstorming to brainstorm, but we're actually taking those ideas and moving through this risk assessment process. Next slide, please. Now we'll look at those structured or semi-structured interviews. As the name implies, those structured interviews use questions that are prepared ahead of time. There is little to no deviation from the prepared questions so that the interview stays in line with those objectives and the topics to be discussed. This type of interview may be used for a specific process or procedure that has been having a problem to identify the risks associated with it. The prepared questions would focus on identifying the risks or problems related to that process to work towards a way to minimize or eliminate them. Semi-structured interviews, on the other hand, are less strict. There is more freedom for conversation to explore areas the participants may want to cover. With those semi-structured interviews, be aware of scope creep, just like with brainstorming. Remain focused on the objectives of the interview and steer the participants back to the topic at hand to ensure that the objectives of the interview are met. Next slide, please. Interviews are just one means of obtaining in-depth information from participants within a group. When the interviews are performed as one-on-one communication, participants may not be as biased by others in the group, so consider if the interviews are going to be large group, small group, or one-on-one. Next slide, please. Regardless of the type of interview that you want to perform, the questions should be open-ended and simple. The questions should be in an appropriate language as well. For this, consider the example of questions geared towards children versus adults, or new employees versus tenured employees. The types of questions and the depth of those questions may be different, as well as the wording of the questions. And finally, the questions should cover only one issue. When we look at complex questions, they rarely lead to an answer that can go further into the assessment to be analyzed and evaluated. Remember that possible follow-up questions to seek clarification should also be prepared ahead of time. Care should be taken also not to lead the interviewee. So the person performing the interview really wants to make sure that they are unbiased and that they allow the interviewee to answer the questions in their own expertise. Next slide, please. The last mechanism that we had on our list was surveys. They are another tool for risk identification, but it's often overlooked as a tool. Surveys can be more restricted in the questions because the survey is static. Whether it's electronic or hard copy, those questions are what is on the survey, and follow-up questioning is difficult, especially if the survey is anonymous. Surveys a benefit of surveys is they can involve a large group of participants, such as an entire organization or members of a trade group. The questions here are typically closed, using yes/no, rating scales, or ranges of options. Open-ended questions can be included, but be cautious of the fact that it is difficult to analyze and evaluate open-ended answers, as each person completing the interview may interpret the question differently or provide differing answers based on their own experience, expertise, or the opinion of the topic at hand. Closed questions are used more frequently in surveys so that the answers can be analyzed statistically. Also, keep in mind that some surveys may require demographic information to interpret the results. So when we're thinking of it from an organizational perspective, the demographic information is probably not going to be where they live, what their gender is, any of those things. It may more be their tenure at the organization. Are they new employee? Are they old employee? What department do they work in? That sort of thing as far as demographic information. Next slide, please. So once you've identified your risks, if you remember in that risk process that Emma presented, we want to analyze and evaluate those risks. There's a lot of different ways that you can do this analysis and evaluation. These are just 4 ways that we want to go over for this webinar. So we have the risk matrix and the risk register. We'll go over what SWIFT means in a second, and then FMEA, which some of you may already be familiar with. Again, additional approaches can be added on to the risk identification approaches here to analyze and evaluate the risk. These are just 4 approaches, and oftentimes similar to identification of risks, these can be combined or used in partial or whole as well. So oftentimes a risk register uses a risk matrix within it. So as with the risk identification approaches, these here can be combined and used in conjunction with one another or at differing times for different risk assessment events, depending on the topic being discussed. So FMEA may be an approach for risk analysis and evaluation that your organization has as part of their risk assessment plan or process, but it may not be applied to every single risk, depending on the severity of the risk. Next slide, please. When we look at the risk matrix, we're looking at consequence and probability so that we can define the level of risk. We look at the probability of the risk occurring, what's the likelihood of it occurring, against the severity or the impact. So sometimes that's called consequence. What are the consequences if that risk occurred? What are the consequences if we don't take that opportunity? It assists with us ranking those risks and opportunities so that we can plan our actions to the proportion of the risk to the organization. This is an input to our evaluation actions. What are we going to do? What actions are we going to take? We want to make sure that our risks are as low as reasonably possible, but we definitely want to look at them with an objective eye on what is the impact to the organization, what is the consequence, and how likely is that risk to occur. The pros of using this risk matrix is that it's relatively easy to use and you can rapidly rank the risks. So if you think back to my sticky note situation, if we were looking at a process or a project and everybody wrote down what could go wrong or what opportunities we could take, you could have this matrix up on the wall and put the sticky notes within the matrix. So we look at one and we say, yeah, that has it's very likely that it could occur, but it really would have no impact to this. We would stick it in that lower green box down at the bottom. So it's a good tool to use for that. And there's a lot of different variations of it. So the cons are it's difficult for common systems across circumstances. So you may use one risk matrix in one circumstance and a different one in another. It's difficult to define those scales unambiguously. And this is why when you do brainstorming or you identify your risks, that you want to have a group of people because you want to have that wide range of people that can say, well, I think that it would have a major impact and someone else says it would be minor. Then you can have that discussion to decide where it's going to be. So you can have some objectivity in a process that has subjectivity in it. And then risks cannot be aggregated here. So we want to look at each risk individually. We don't want to say, well, this group of risks goes here and this group of risks goes there. So let's go ahead to the next slide and take a look at that risk register. So as with the risk matrix, the risk registers are relatively easy to use. The register contains the identification of the risk, an analysis of the likelihood and consequences or impact, with the level of risk calculated from that. Any evaluations performed, the actions planned or taken, the progress, the status and the owner, for example. This information is all in one place with the risk register. And as you can see here on this example we have at the bottom of the slide, the risk matrix was used for ranking the risks, and a color coding was used to quickly identify and categorize the risks. This assists in determining which risks to address first. So the downside of using a risk register, I'm still on that slide, please, is that it must be communicated and available to not only the owners of the risk, but also those individuals impacted by it, be that the process owners, the individuals performing the work, etc. Also, the risk register has to be updated regularly. This is not a one and done exercise. Someone or someones must be responsible for monitoring the register and ensuring that the actions being taken are being taken and that they're effective in addressing the risks. Next slide, please. So one of the other techniques we had on our list was SWIFT. This is a structured what-if technique. Structured what-if technique is similar to structured interviews and brainstorming and is considered a structured brainstorming technique. It is used for high-level risk identification, and it can be used independently or as part of a hazard analysis or HAZOP, or as part of the FMEA process. So here you have a facilitator, and they ask questions about a scenario to participants in a workshop where they use predetermined sets of guide words. So the questions are going to start with what if or how could. So let's go to the next slide and we'll talk more about that. The questions as part of the SWIFT seek to understand known risks, risk sources and drivers, and previous experience, successes, and incidents. Known or existing controls are explored to determine if they would be effective to address the risks identified in the SWIFT process. It is also a way to evaluate regulatory requirements and any constraints by asking questions, such as, what if the regulatory requirements change? What then? Or what if we do not comply to requirement XYZ? What then? What could happen? What if? So the facilitator creates these what if questions to evaluate, to analyze and evaluate those risks that were identified in that first step of the process. Next slide, please. So failure mode and effects analysis, or FMEA, is one of the more widely known methods for analyzing and evaluating risks. It's a systematic, proactive method for evaluating a process to identify where and how it may fail, then to assess the relative impact of different failures in order to identify the parts of the process that are most in need of change. Think back to that risk matrix. We're categorizing them so we can hit those heavy hitters first. It divides the elements into hardware, software, process, and procedures. It's applicable to evaluation of a product, an individual, or a step in a process, or a whole system. You identify where the failures could conceivably occur and what steps would lead to a failure. So in this first part, that's that first step. So we can combine FMEA with our brainstorming and move from brainstorming into this FMEA. Then we evaluate the impact of a failure. So similar to that structured what if there is a failure? Then what? What's the consequence? What's the likelihood? We've already said those words as part of the risk matrix and risk register as well. So you can see how all of these are kind of intertwined. The FMEA provides information that can be considered for risk mitigation and elimination as well. During this process, ways each element might fail and the failure causes and effects are evaluated. Next slide, please. When performing FMEA, you want to evaluate the function, the failure mode, the mechanisms that could produce those modes of failure, the nature of the consequences, whether the failure is harmless or damaging. So again, the consequence, the nature of the consequence, but then is it harmless or damaging? How would you detect that failure? So that's where FMEA goes that step further and says, what do we have in place to detect when that failure occurs or when it's going to occur? And then it also lists out those existing provisions to compensate for failure. So what do we have in place today that could prevent that failure from occurring? Or what do we need to put in place? So you need to keep a record of this evaluation in the form of a report. And this is oftentimes in a table format. Next slide, please. FMEA is really used to identify single failure modes and not combinations of failure modes. That gets too complex for the FMEA process. Unless adequately controlled and focused, the studies can be time-consuming and costly. And this is why oftentimes FMEA is used for those larger risks or opportunities and not for every single risk or opportunity that's being evaluated. It can become difficult and tedious for complex, multi-layered systems. It's typically applied during design, manufacture, or operation of a physical system, and it's used to improve the designs, select between design alternatives, and plan maintenance programs. As with other approaches, it can be combined with the other approaches and also can be used as a starting point for cause analysis. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Emma to go over some conclusions. Oh, wait, yeah, Emma, you're doing the conclusions, right? I'm sorry, everyone.
Yes, that's
Okay.
fine.
We'll go back
Thank
to
you.
Emma for her to sum up what we've talked about today, talk about some additional resources, and then we'll move on to your questions.
Yes, thank you, Melanie, for that wonderful presentation of all of those different approaches. And just to summarize, risk-based thinking. Risk-based thinking really is a way to incorporate a process into your management system where it becomes an everyday thing that you do. And everybody can be involved with it, with identifying risks and opportunities, analyzing those risks and opportunities, evaluating them, and then planning that response and responding to them. And that is the basic approach to doing risk-based thinking. Have that process in place where you can have people be able to identify, analyze, evaluate, and respond. And there's not any one approach that you have to use. Melanie went through several approaches for identification and how to identify risks or opportunities, and then how to analyze and evaluate those. And of course, the response is based on your management system and the response or the action that you want to take regarding that risk and that opportunity. Really, in the end, putting this process in place, using this approach for risk-based thinking does help to ensure greater knowledge of risks, and it helps improve your preparedness in your management system. So you can be prepared because you're going to be aware of the potential risks that could occur, that could have a negative impact. And you're going to be prepared with the action to take if that risk were to occur. And that is going to help you, one, prevent some of these negative impacts from occurring, help you to take advantage of these opportunities of improvement, and then help you to be prepared to more reactively react to a nonconformity when it does happen, because you're going to have your response already figured out. So it really does, in the end, help you increase the probability of reaching your objectives, reaching those desired results that you want, getting that quality product out the door, and it helps reduce the probability of the negative results. So you're going to prevent nonconformities from happening because you're going to have a greater sense and a greater awareness of your management system and the risks and the opportunities within that management system. In the end, it makes prevention a habit for everybody. It's going to be the way that you come to work and do your work day in and day out. So with that, I do want to thank Melanie and David for and myself for the opportunity for being able to provide you with this information. And we will take your questions. So if you have any questions, please do type those into the Q&A pod. We do have a few that have come in, and we'll get to those questions in just a minute. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about some of the additional resources that we have for accredited laboratories and laboratories that are seeking accreditation. ANAB has several different resources available to help you further your understanding of standards, of the accreditation process, of the management system, and of the ISO documents and assessments in general. On the ANAB website, there are free webcasts on a variety of topics. These webcasts are typically 15 to 20 minutes long, depending on the topic, and can be viewed at any time. Also, ANAB has a blog page, if you weren't aware. This has a wealth of information related to risks, accreditation, standards, requirements, corrective actions, and other things that individuals blog about. As you are aware, we do have these monthly webinars of various topics, so please check back frequently to check out what the next topic will be about. And finally, ANAB offers training in many areas, including internal auditing training, an overview of standards, corrective action process, and measurement uncertainty, to name a few. As with assessments, training has changed significantly within the pandemic and with travel restrictions that are now not as restrictive as they have been in the last few years, but all of our traditional in-person courses have been converted to online versions, which include exercises as well and discussion related information to the topic at hand. So please check out our training webpage. We have these courses available both online, live with instructors, as well as in person. We also offer web-based self-paced training. And all of these resources can be found on the ANAB website at anab.ansi.org. So now let's get to the fun part and address any questions or the questions that you have.
Emma, there's a question that says, I'm new in the quality department of a small accredited lab. I don't even know where to get started with implementation of a risk and opportunity system. Any ideas, suggestions, or recommended resources?
Oh, absolutely. One of the hardest things to do is jumping in and getting your feet wet. And sometimes not knowing where to start is the biggest hurdle. But right here, Melanie is giving some great ideas on where to start. And I would start personally, myself as a new quality manager, when I came into it, I started with the standard and with the standard required. So if you can pick up any standard that you have, the 17025 standard, if you go to the section 8.5, it lays out there the 3 things to do for risk-based thinking and what you have to have in your management system. And it's what we had discussed earlier in the presentation, and I outlined at the very beginning. And it is very general, but it does give you the place to start. It starts with that 8.5.1 and saying, why do we do this? We want to do risk-based thinking so we can have this proactive approach. And then it goes about telling you how to do it. And it gives you, again, a very general approach. So start there with that standard, and then get with your management team, your quality team, the people in the laboratory, and do some of that brainstorming and think about, how are we going to implement this in our management system? One, you have to identify risks and opportunities, and you can think about, how are we going to do that? And then we need to think about how we're going to evaluate it. No one approach is the best fit for every risk or opportunity. You get to decide the approach to take.
Okay, we have another question from Diana Tabor stating that, okay, you say that that's been answered on scope creep. Okay, thank you.
That was the question, the prior question. So Diana said, I'm guilty of scope creep myself. Do you have some examples of good phrases to get a group back on topic? I fear I sound like an elementary school teacher when I try to. Definitely, it can be like herding cats. And Emma, if you're okay with that, I'll take this question. One of my favorite techniques, Diana, is to use a parking lot. We didn't discuss it here because it goes beyond the scope of our webinar, but really tape a picture of a parking lot up on the wall. And if somebody keeps going off topic and it's something that needs to be addressed at some point, just not in that meeting, write it down, slap it on that parking lot, and then record it somewhere to come back to it later. So if it's something that's like, yes, that is a problem, but that's not what we're discussing today, we'll take that idea and let's have another brainstorming session or another risk session to talk about that idea. or maybe it's something that could be fed into a continuous improvement system, or, if it is a nonconformity, it could go into your corrective action system. But it really helps individuals visualize that you care what they're saying and that you do want their input. You just need to stay on topic. So you take that as an action item to take out of the meeting and handle at a different time.
And Melanie, I wanted to come back to one of the first questions from Ellie. There is a resource that is available out there. It's an ISO document. This ISO document is on risk assessment techniques. And this is where you can find 32 different risk assessment techniques, I believe. It's IEC ISO 31010. And there's also a terms and definitions document that goes with that, the 31,000 document.
Yes, and both of those documents are really great and were used as part of the creation of this webinar to get some of the ideas for that risk analysis and risk identification. So it is a great document to take a look at.
Okay, we have a new question. As a new business that hasn't had much experience in the industry, what aspects should I consider as the first few when doing my analysis?
Very good question. Thinking about that analysis of that risk that is coming into play. And so this is regarding, could you repeat the first part of that? A new business or new technology that's coming into the business?
Yeah, as a new business that hasn't had much experience in the industry, what aspects should I consider in the first few when doing my analysis, when identifying that risk as low, medium, or high? How do I decide on which parameters I should be using?
Right. So going back to like the risk matrix approach, and Melanie, I hope you're okay with me jumping in on this one.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, you can certainly jump in as well. Going back to that risk matrix approach, it's one of the ones that I like to use when I'm assessing or analyzing the risk, because I think about the impact of that risk and the severity of that impact if the risk were to occur, as well as the likelihood of that risk to occur. So if you think back to this risk matrix approach, you can plug it in and you get to decide how you want to define that severity and how you want to define that probability. But to me, this is a pretty simple approach to use on the surface to sort of analyze that risk. And it's a visual approach, so everybody can see where you decided to put that risk as far as impact and likelihood that it were to occur. As Melanie did mention, it could be subjective because what I think is severe, you might think is minor. And so that's where the subjectivity comes in. But it is one way to get everybody in the room and start thinking about that risk and how to analyze that risk. And of course, you can think about, depending on what the risk is, the impact to your operations, the impact to the quality of the product, the impact to the customer, and how it's going to impact the ability to get the product out the door at the level of quality you need, the impact to your own performance measures. So those are some of the impacts that you can think about, meaning the severity. How is all of the impact on those things going to add up to the severity of that risk if it were to happen?
Okay, well, that looks like we've addressed the questions that are on the table. Well, there's one. Any literature out there on the topic that could be helpful? Any specific documentation?
I think as we mentioned, the ISO IEC document, the 31,010 document, as well as the 31,000 terms and definitions document, is one of the primary documents that I've used and Melanie's used. You can just Google risk-based thinking, and there are lots of documents out there for risk-based thinking. A lot of different approaches that come into play, but primarily the ISO document is the one that I have fallen back to.
All right. Well, I am grateful to the presenters. I'm grateful to the participants today. Thank you, everyone, for participating. This is the end of today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.